Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about F1 legends. If you've been a listener in our community for any amount of time, you know I'm a bit of a nerd and history geek. Well, I came across an article titled The Best Formula One Drivers Ever, Hamilton, Senna, and More. This led to a discussion with the guys, because you know we're always talking about racing. Well, Dick and I had the idea to sit down and record a series of conversations going back to the beginning of Formula One in the 1950s. And since it's the 75th anniversary of Formula One, it seems like a great time to release it. The hope is that those who are newer to the sport will gain a deeper appreciation for names you might hear, or even names you might not have heard, who have helped shape the sport into what it is today. Before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Dick, I am looking forward to the start of another series with you that I think is going to be very interesting, not only personally for myself, but I think a lot of our audience. And here's just to clue in our audience how this came to be. I came across an article that was titled The Best Formula One Drivers Ever, Hamilton, Senna, and More. And not to detract from a single champion that was on that list, I just wondered if recency bias might have been a factor. And so this led to a discussion with you, Dick, about how we could focus on those who had laid the foundations for what we're enjoying today in F1. And then you came back and said, let's go through the decades and look at the dominant driver of each particular era. And I just love that idea. So for our audience, here's the hope. That through this conversation, if you're new to the sport, then you receive more context on the names that are thrown out in the course of, conversations, i.e. with fans who have been longtime fans, or if you're listening to even commentary while the race is happening or from other podcasts, we think that this is really good for you. And then if you're a longtime fan, then you're likely to have an emotional reaction to what we're going to say, because these aren't necessarily just names to you, maybe especially as we go later into the years, these are drivers that you remember watching. And then if they're older names, maybe they're names that you've heard about from even more seasoned F1 fans that you know about, considering we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. And so when we say go back to the beginning, we're going to start with the 1950s. So I've also read a few articles and books and watched some documentaries, and it has struck me how much progress the sport has made. And so I think it's cool that we're going to go all the way back to the 1950s with the first person, Juan Manuel Fangio. Dick, I laid it all out there for you. Tell us about Fangio. Anything else you want to say?
Absolutely. So, Fangio is such an interesting guy. He got to Europe quite late. He was born in Argentina, very, very humble circumstances, quite frankly. Like he dropped out of school when he was like 11, I think. But, very, very intelligent guy, with very much a natural mechanic. And he would enter in these races that would go on for weeks down in Latin America, where they would go for thousands and thousands of miles. And he developed this enormous ability from the standpoint of not only being a mechanic and engineer, but also as a driver having mechanical sympathy. I mean, he really understood how cars worked. And so he came to Europe, very late in the game. I mean, these days you would never ever see somebody like that come in, that late into the sport, so to speak. But he came in, clearly showed his mettle, and at the end of the day, he won 24 Grand Prix out of 51 races. And to give you an idea, that's a winning percentage of 47%. And he's the highest winning percentage driver in the sport. And pretty amazing guy because, of course, the cars back then were big, heavy beasts. I mean, the standard joke was, Formula One back then was, that's when the drivers were fat, the tires were skinny. And so Fangio kind of fit that bill, quite frankly. He is just
Yes.
super strong. Didn't look fit, but he was mentally tough. I think that it's really fascinating to see not only how the cars have changed, but how the drivers have changed.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
um, and but at the same time, one of the things that I think was really very interesting too is that he may have been the very first guy who came in and figured out how to build the team around himself. He always made a point of making friends with his mechanics. And he really endeared himself to them by like going and working on the car alongside of these guys. And so they were the ones who knew that A, he was one of them, and B, if they could find time in the car, he was going to exploit it because he was so physically strong. And, the Grand Prix back in those days, they lasted over 3 hours. So they were wrestling those beasts in a very, very physical way, no power steering and all that kind of stuff. And you have to understand the cars were still going, I think, about 180, 190 miles an hour. So,
Mhm.
a car with no downforce on really, really skinny tires going through Eau Rouge at Spa, serious bravery, serious muscle, serious finesse. So anyway, he just flat wore his opposition down because it took a lot of stamina to drive those cars. And the other guys, they'd start wearing out because they weren't as physically strong or mentally tough. And next thing you know, Fangio would make a pass for the lead and he was gone. It's just really remarkable. But anyway, he only drove 7 seasons of Formula One and he only started 51 Grand Prix. So, that's an average of just over 7 Grand Prix a year. But he started on the front row 48 times out of 51 and he had 29 pole positions. So this guy was amazing. Won 47% of those races and a total of 35 podiums and 23 fastest laps. So anyway, he was 46 when he won his last title. And I think what was really, really interesting is that while money has always been a big deal in the sport, and most of the guys on the grid, you know, certainly have come from a certain amount of family wealth, Fangio was dirt poor, man. And so he was he was one of the very first where people were sort of like, yeah, I don't care that this guy doesn't have any money. I want him in my car because I want to win. Kind of a fun fact about this guy in 1958, he became an even bigger international celebrity when he was kidnapped in Cuba by members of Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement because they wanted to draw attention to their cause. And the guy was so charming that eventually his captors just said, "Yeah, we're just gonna let him go." Unharmed, and off he went. When it was all over with, he went back to his home in Argentina and lived out his years. He occasionally showed up at Grand Prix. He was there a couple of times when Senna won, and was invited on the podium, to be with Senna and all that, which was a really moving thing, I know, for Ayrton. So anyway, he died in 1995 at the age of 84. And to think about the era of racing that he raced in at the age that he raced at, the guy was really remarkable.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I had read something that said he was like only 5'7" and like you said, a very stocky kind of build
Yep.
and not what we think of today of these athletes who are going in and spending so much time in the gym and their nutrition is managed, all those different types of things.
Right.
And then when you couple it with the type of car, very different than what we're talking about we see today on the grid. It really is an era new people can fully grasp unless you
Right.
try really hard to go and encounter these vehicles, try to go and find some really good documentaries that talk about this, but we really can't fully understand what the experience and sheer scrappiness that he must
Right.
have had. I was reading something completely not related to Fangio, but it was talking about how at the end of the day, the racing is a solitary thing because it is the driver and how he is one with the car, right?
Yep.
And that it really is ultimately down to him. And when I was reading just a couple of things about Fangio, I thought that was said, what I read was in the context of the 2020s, but how even more that must have been for back then. You didn't have someone in a radio in your ear.
Right.
You're driving down these long stretches of, because it was more dirt roads, right? It's not like tracks like what we're accustomed to
Yeah,
today.
public roads. They'd be
Public roads,
paved,
that's
but
right.
yeah, they weren't,
Right.
but yeah.
Yeah. Because it made me, I remembered, I can't remember which driver it was. You told me there was a video where he's driving, I think in Le Mans, and he's singing as he's going. And I thought, like, if that happened today, we would never, we would laugh kind of, because we laugh even today when, the mics are caught of the drivers. But it just made me think of Fangio, and how very simple, but also very rustic, I think is the word I was thinking.
Sure.
Rustic, it was the type of driving, and that gave me even more respect for what you're saying about the
Yep.
skill and the age. Because we talk about today with Fernando being the age that he is, like if we did a comparison of the two, like the level of physicality that Fangio needed to have to sustain that is kind of remarkable and worth acknowledging. So I'm really glad that you brought him up. Now, didn't you say also that he did a lot of long distance events in
Yep.
addition to Grand Prix?
Yeah, I mean, that's where he really cut his teeth. And those were, they were always like the Panamera something or other, where it was sedans, and they go from like the northern part of Mexico all the way down to the tip of South America or something like that. It'd just go on forever. And, cars would break down and you'd have to figure out how to repair them and then get caught back up. And, it was just
Mhm.
unbelievable. Yeah.
So that would be kind of like what we think of what Carlos Sainz's dad does. What
Yeah.
racing is that?
Yeah.
What
Well,
car
that
is
would
that?
be kind of a rally.
Yeah, yeah, kind of like that, but not
Yeah.
quite. It was
Not quite,
my
but yeah, very much like that, yeah. Which, by the way,
interesting.
massive tip of the hat to Carlos Senior winning Dakar again for the 4th time.
Isn't he?
Amazing accomplishment.
Yeah, I saw some social media posts where they were showing he was setting up his own tent so he could go to sleep. And they said it doesn't matter if you're the driver or not, you're still gonna have to set up your own tent. And I laughed, and you could see the joy that he gets from the execution of driving. And
Yeah,
I was really impressed by that. So
yeah,
cool, so cool.
very cool.
Okay. So next driver that you have selected is Jack Brabham.
Yep.
Tell us about him.
Really interesting guy. Another one of these guys that, he kind of got into racing where it was yeah, we'll go do this. And, oh, well, I'm pretty good at it. And, one thing led to another. And suddenly finds out he's world champion. And in Bradley's case, he's born in Australia. And like Fangio, he started as a mechanic or engineer type, and then began racing in his home country after World War II. And really, he really wanted to be a pilot, actually. And but one thing led to another, and he, for whatever reason, the Royal Australian Air Force did not need him for World War II, but they needed his engineering and mechanicking skills. And so when he got out of the military in 1946, he set up his own little engineering business, and a friend started racing in the Australian midget championships, which was exactly like, if you know anything about American racing, it's fairly short dirt ovals, quarter mile, 3/8 of a mile, somewhere in there, some of them are half mile dirt, and front engined, open wheeled, open cockpit cars that are racing on these dirt ovals, and very, very competitive. And this friend did it for a couple of years, and Brabham was his mechanic and engineer and all that. And the guy lost interest. And so Brabham says, well, gosh, I guess I'll give it a go. Well, he won 4 consecutive Australian midget championships in the process. And while he was at it, he also won the Australian Hill Climb Championship in 1953, driving a Cooper Bristol. And I bring this up because Cooper played a huge role in his career. A couple of years later, Brabham went off to England to, see what he could do, kind of go out to a bigger pond to race in, so to speak, instead of just Australia. And so he went to the Cooper brothers, John and Charles, who had built his hill climb car, and started building up a friendship, with these guys. And eventually he talked them into building a Formula One car. Now, what was interesting is that Cooper had always built like Formula Three cars and this hill climb car, and they were known for being tiny, tiny little cars, and they always had the engines in the back. People call them rear engine cars. Technically, they were really mid engine cars, which is what all, Formula cars today are. They're mid engine, meaning the engine is between the bulkhead at the rear of the car that separates the driver from the engine, but it's ahead of the transaxle and the rear tires. A true rear engine car would actually have the engine back above or behind the rear tires. So anyway, getting technical on you because I can't help
That was
myself.
great. I didn't know that, and I love that you threw that in. Thank you.
Sure. And what this did is by moving that engine towards the back, it allowed the rear tires, which are the driven tires in a Formula One car, it allowed them to have a bit more weight, so they had better traction. It also allowed them to build a much more aerodynamic car. They eliminated the drive shaft that in those days, you had the engine out front. Well, the drive shaft literally ran underneath the driver's seat back to the rear axle to drive the rear tires. And so by eliminating that drive shaft, took out weight, but it also allowed you to run the car a whole lot lower. It could be built much, much lower. And so the center of gravity of the car also went down. So there was all sorts of really good reasons to go and build the car with a mid-engine. And so they had to go, they didn't have an engine contract or anything like that. So they went to a company called Coventry Climax and had them uh, basically build an engine that was based on an engine that was used for pumping water out of mines in England, coal mines in England. And they repurposed it to be a Formula One engine. And so, as you can imagine, it didn't have just a whole bunch of horsepower compared to the Ferraris and Maseratis and the other cars of the day. But because of the aerodynamics and the superior handling and all that kind of stuff, they showed up and they started winning races. And in 1959, Brabham won his first world championship by just scoring a couple of wins, but it was like really consistent finishes. The car was quick, and the writing was starting to come on the wall, although people were still sort of like, I don't know. But then in 1960, Brabham utterly dominated the championship. He won 5 of the 9 races, finished well in the others. And so he was a 2-time world champion, winning back to back. The problem with Cooper was, of course, is here they are, they're running basically a water pump engine for their for their power unit. Although Coventry Climax was starting to become interested in Formula One, and they started designing engines that were more for the purpose of Formula One, and they actually stuck around for several years. But the problem is that Cooper really wasn't a works team like a Ferrari or a Porsche or some of the others. And so the other manufacturers caught up to them. They had better technology, better engines, all that. And so 1961 was a really tough year for Brabham. And he said, you know what? I'm just going to go out and start building my own car. So in 1962, the first Brabham Formula One car showed up, and he had aligned himself with a brilliant engineer named Ron Taranic. And they were sort of like, think, Adrian Newey and any of the guys that won a world championship for him. I mean, they were just like really close, really great working relationship kind of deal. And Ron was an Aussie, so they understood each other. And so they slowly built up that team to the point where when the regulations changed at the end of 1965, going to a new engine, which is the 3-liter V8, or well, just the 3-liter engine, it could be a V8, could be a V12, and even one team took two flat 8 engines that were 1.5 liter and stacked them on top of each other, made an H16. And that's how they solved their 3-liter engine problem, believe it or not. It didn't last for very long. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, Brabham went to a company called Repco, which was an Australian company that built automobile parts. And he convinced them to build him a Formula One engine using, believe it or not, an Oldsmobile engine. And so they started with an Oldsmobile block, made it a 3-liter engine. It's a V8. And because of the change in the engine regulations, the engine put out good horsepower and was reliable. And everybody else struggled with reliability and horsepower. So guess what? Brabham won his third world championship in 1966 at 40 years old. And he is the only man to win a world championship in a car that bore his name. And what struck me about this was it's really interesting because we all remember when the new turbo hybrid era came into being for Formula One, Mercedes got it right. Everybody else got it wrong. Guess what? Mercedes won the world championship. Kind of a similar story with Brabham, really. And, the competition really didn't catch up because in 1967, Brabham's teammate was a New Zealander by the name of Denny Hulme. Well, Denny took the Brabham Repco. Yeah, he had Jack Brabham as his teammate, but he won the world championship. So Brabham wound up having 2 Formula One world championships in cars that bore his name. One as a driver constructor, the other one as a constructor. Really cool story. So anyway, at the end of the 1970 season, he retired. He won his last race that year in South Africa. Nearly won the Monaco Grand Prix, was leading, and with about a lap to go, was going into one of the corners, missed his braking point, went straight in and hit the barriers, and so Jochen Rindt won the first of his 5 that year because of the error that Brabham made. He recovered, finished second at that race, but that was really kind of the end of it for him. Anyway, he sold the team to Bernie Ecclestone, of all people, and moved back home to Australia. And there he ran a farm, an aviation business, and a car dealership. So he did quite well. He died in 2014 at the age of 88. But he also not only was the first and only racing driver to win a world championship in a car that he built, he was also the first racing driver to be knighted by the Queen of England. The other thing he was known for was he was a Formula One driver who drove his cars as if they were midgets on a dirt oval, hung the tail out, drove it sideways, all that kind of stuff. So interesting guy.
I think that is so fantastic. I'm listening to you, and 2 things that came to my mind was the engineering and driver aspect of him. I wonder if the reason for his success at the level that we're seeing is because in most cases, right, drivers are not engineers. And so trying to communicate that which they're seeing or feeling when they're in the car, there's that loop, right, of information that needs to go to the engineering team and also, of course, to the design aspect of it. And then being so central to the vision of what's happening in its built. We kind of say right now, the car in Red Bull is built for Max. Some people say that. And here it sounds like these cars were built for Brabham. And he, because of his expertise and knowledge, he was really able to leverage that moment. And I like how you highlighted the rules change, because that also helped in putting them in the right position at that right moment. That's really cool. I think I mentioned it earlier. I have a book that I've been reading that's called The Champions in Formula One, and it mentioned this whole being knighted by the Queen of England. I want to read to you what it noted about him, because it's kind of comical when you say who he is. It says, he had come a long way in every sense, Jack being the first F1 driver to fly his own plane to races in Europe. But despite this elevated status in life, Brabham continued to enjoy being down to earth and getting his hands dirty whenever the occasion demanded, no matter how unexpected. Officials at Buckingham Palace in June 1966 were somewhat alarmed when they found Brabham in a courtyard, top hat cast aside and still decked out in his morning suit after receiving an OBE, lying beneath his road car and whacking a jammed starter motor. There was no mechanical misfortune 13 years later when Brabham became the first man to receive a knighthood for services to motor racing. I thought that was just the coolest thing. Like,
It's great.
this guy who has achieved so much in the skill, and yet I'm just like everybody. And I love that. That's something I think we need more in this generation. And that seems to me that era, it was very much like that. But then it seems like he might have even taken it to the fullest extent of not thinking too highly of himself. I love that. Okay.
Well,
so-
and Denny Hulme, he raced barefoot because he said that he could feel the pedals better. And of course, they said, no, you're going to wear driving shoes. And he was very, very upset because back in Australia and New Zealand, they would let him race barefoot.
Oh, that's hilarious. So you mean his teammate?
His teammate. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Wow.
they were 2 feet from a pond. Yeah.
Nice. Well, they got that synergy there. That's cool. I really love that. Okay. So the next driver that you have selected is Jim Clark. Tell us about him.
Yeah. So even though it's nearly impossible to judge a driver from one generation to another, there's no doubt that Jim Clark was one of the all-time greatest drivers. We talk about Fangio and he won, something like 47%, I think is the official number of all the races that he entered. Jim Clark wound up winning one more race than Fangio did. Fangio, again, had 24 wins. Clark had 25. But what's interesting is his winning percentage was 35%. So while Fangio was 47, there's Jim Clark at 35%, call it. And really, the only other person who's in the 30% range was Lewis Hamilton. So pretty amazing. Alberto Ascari, way, way, way back in the day, he was at 40%, but I mean, that's it, So Clark clearly, from a win perspective, he was, like number 3 percentage wise. So pretty amazing guy. But anyway, he got into racing kind of by accident. He was one of those guys that clearly had just this gift for driving cars fast. And so what would happen is that when people started recognizing his talent, the wealthy enthusiasts would say, here, drive my car, and so he'd go and drive his, some guy's car and go and win a race and everybody would be excited. And next thing you know, somebody else said, well, come drive my car. And so that's how he did it. If it wasn't for the fact that these people spotted his talent at a young age, he probably never would have gone past anywhere in racing because he was a sheep farmer. And so anyway, one thing led to another, and he wound up doing a partial season in Formula One in 1960, driving for Team Lotus, which coincidentally, that's the only team he ever drove for in Formula One. He drove for them, for basically 9 seasons. His first full season came in 1961, and that was clouded by Clark's involvement in the Wolfgang von Trips accident at the Italian Grand Prix. Von Trips was with a name like that, he's German. But he was driving for Ferrari and vying for the world championship with his teammate at Ferrari, none other than Phil Hill from America. In the Grand Prix, there was a crash. Clark was involved. He was innocent of any wrongdoing. But anyway, Von Tripp was killed in the crash along with about 14 spectators. And therefore, Phil Hill became world champion. But at the end of the day, it upset Clark so much that he seriously thought about retiring right then and there. However, his friends talked him out of it because they knew what kind of talent they were talking about here. And so Clark came back, and from 1962 to 1965, Clark pretty much dominated every season in Formula One. He lost the championship in 62 and 64 to oil leaks in the final race of the season, which caused him to have a DNF. But in 63, he dominated with 7 wins, and then in 1965, he had 6 wins. He also won the Indy 500 in 1965. So think about this. You win the Indy 500 and the World Championship in the same year. This was the first time that a mid-engine car won the Indy 500. So some very notable firsts, to say the least. And so to win the Indy 500 and the World Championship in the same year is absolutely remarkable. The thing that was interesting about Clark, though, is that he was known as being very shy and very humble. Some of his counterparts, like Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart, I mean, those guys were very confident, very much extroverts, loved the limelight. They were very surprised to see that he was really just the opposite Clark. In the car, Clark was, calm and collected, never seemed to make a mistake, always controlled his aggression. But out of it, he was constantly chewing his fingernails and was very indecisive. I mean, he couldn't figure out what kind of restaurant he wanted to go to. And so, it was very, very interesting that this very shy and humble man who hated the limelight was unwillingly thrown into the limelight because of his enormous talent. Anyway, in January of 1968, Clark won his 25th Grand Prix, surpassing Fangio, winning the South African Grand Prix. And just a few months later in April, he was killed in a Formula 2 race at the Hockenheim Ring in Germany, and he was 32 at the time. So he had a lot of years left if he chose to go racing, although there has been a persistent rumor that he was going to retire at the end of the 1968 season. He probably would have won the world championship again that year because Colin Chapman had produced the Lotus 49, which had the Ford Cosworth engine. And that was a brilliant combination that no doubt Clark would have exploited, but we'll never know for sure. So anyway, Clark's legacy is, because of his death, it's one that began the movement towards improved driver and circuit safety. And he's left his mark on many future Scottish racing drivers for sure, many drivers anyway, but especially in Scotland. And that includes Jackie Stewart and Dario Franchitti. So really an interesting guy.
Yeah. Well, I like that you noted his legacy outside of obviously the winning aspect, but about the circuit safety and in driver safety, especially because I don't know where this will hit with all the other stuff that we have been recording, but another conversation about improvements in safety over the course of the sport's history. I think it's really good as to note to our audience that that's well worth your time to hear more about that very tragic death. But where people like Jackie Stewart, I think this gives another layer to it, that relational aspect of it, why that relationship, because of who he was. I love how you pointed out he was an introvert. As an introvert myself, I totally can understand what you're saying about this reluctance, but then also wanting to do and to compete. I was trying to explain to people, at least in my case, and then reading a couple of things about Jim Clark, it resonated with me as well, is my competition isn't anybody else, it's myself. I want to improve myself. And if in the process I win, that's fantastic. But I'm really just trying to be and to do and to see where I can push myself to be a better person than I was a day ago, an hour ago, whatever that may be. So I love people like him who, despite what other people's perception of what excellence or leadership looks like, he gives a different example of that you don't have to be a loud person. And then, the stuff that you're saying about his indecisiveness off the track, how that's also shows his humanity. And that we don't know what led to that kind of indecisiveness or trauma might be in the background. When I was reading a little bit about him, two things that I thought was great. One, it said his tombstone, the inscription on his tombstone said farmer. That was the first line. And the second line is world champion motor racing driver. And I thought, that's really cool. I mean, he had that level of humility similar to what we've already discussed with some of our other drivers already. And that seems to exude in this generation. I love a quote that was in this book from him. It was never a matter of feeling I had to prove anything to myself or anyone. I was curious to find out what it was like to drive a car fast, to drive on a certain circuit, and to drive a certain type of car. I found I enjoyed motor racing. I started as an amateur, as a hobby, with no intention of becoming a world champion. And then now for you to tell us all the cool stuff that he did and the legacy of staying with Lotus that whole time. That's really admirable. And I can see why you think he was the one we should pull out for this conversation, which leads me to a name that you said earlier that's kind of on the other side of the spectrum of personality, Graham Hill. Tell us a little bit about Graham.
Yeah, I mean, he was a little bit of the cartoon Englishman in that, very much a swashbuckler. He'll never be recognized as this great talent like a Jim Clark. But on the other hand, Hill was tenacious. No one ever questioned his courage. And the guy, he just found a way to get it done. He was one of those kind of average talent guys that just had this amazing work ethic, right? And he was a huge extrovert. And so when he began winning races, he became a media darling because he was funny and charming and he loved the spotlight, loved to give a good quote, all that kind of stuff. So while Clark was happy to just kind of stay in the shadows and be a wallflower, here's a Graham Hill who, here's a camera and a spotlight, let's go, one of those kind of deals. So in 1962, driving for a team called British Racing Motors, or BRM, which is really not a fancy team. They were sort of, I don't know, they'd been in the sport by then sort of 12 years and had basically been quite the failure. But Hill got in there and ingratiated himself with the team, got all the mechanics and designers working together, and they built a good enough car that he was then able to go in and win 4 Grand Prix and his first world championship at Jim Clark's expense. Because remember, in 1962, Clark lost the championship because of an oil leak in the last race. Well, when he broke down, Hill came through, scored enough points, and he became the world champion. So he then raced with BRM for a few more seasons and then moved to Lotus, where he actually was the number 2 driver to Jim Clark. But Clark unfortunately died in April of 1968. And just a couple weeks later, a young English racing driver named Mike Spence was testing a car, a Lotus, at Indianapolis. He had a terrible crash and was killed. So now Lotus had killed off 2 of their drivers in less than a month. And so, as you can imagine, the team was just gutted. And Hill came in and got everybody to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, got them refocused. They had a great car in the Lotus 49 with the Cosworth engine. He was able to turn that morale around. He won 3 Grand Prix in 1968 and his second world championship. So, remarkable story. In 1969, he won Monaco for the 5th time, which then gave him the nickname Mr. Monaco. Others have won it that many times since then, but he was the first to win it 5 times. And as it turned out, that was his last Grand Prix win. He had a huge wreck in the last race of the season, which was the U.S. Grand Prix. Hill's Lotus had spun and stalled, so he got out, somehow push-started it, and then jumped back in the car and resumed driving without fastening his seatbelts. Problem was is that later on in the race, a tire suddenly deflated, which pitched the Lotus into a bank and threw Hill out, breaking his right knee and dislocating his left. And so he recovered and continued racing, but he was really never the same driver again. He drove for a couple teams, Brabham being one of them. He then formed his own team in 1973, and which is called Embassy Hill. And he retired then in 1975 after the Monaco Grand Prix. But what's interesting about this guy is that in addition to his Formula One victories, and in addition to 2 world championships, he also won Le Mans in 1972, and he also won the Indy 500 in 1968. And he is the only guy to have ever won the Triple Crown. You think about Mario Andretti. Well, Mario won the world championship and he won the Indy 500, but he never won Le Mans. And today, the only guy with a shot at winning the Triple Crown is Fernando Alonso. Fred has won Le Mans, he's won the world championship, and he came close to winning the Indy 500 on his first try, but he hasn't won that one yet. So I suspect old Fred will be back at Indy before too long. Graham won 14 Grand Prix, and so he had a win percentage of only about 8%. But again, the guy was tenacious and he found a way to get it done. Sadly, after he retired, he continued to focus on managing his F1 team. But unfortunately, when he was flying his plane back from France after a testing session and was attempting to land in the fog at his home airport, and instead he crashed and it killed him. His rising star driver for his team was a young English kid named Tony Bryce. Tony was killed and 4 other team members. So that was just a tragic end to the whole deal. At the end of the day, the other thing that in addition to the Triple Crown and what he did for Lotus in 1968, Hill is also remembered as being the father of Damon Hill, who also won a world championship. And Graham and Damon are one of 2 father-son world championship duos. So pretty cool. They were the first to do it.
I like that. about Damon Hill at the end that you threw in there. I wonder if he will be on your list when we go to future eras.
I always like that guy.
Yeah. Don't tell us because I know we'll just have to wait and see
We'll
if
have to
it's gonna
see.
be on your list.
Exactly.
So this is something I wanted to tie back to, again, not knowing where this episode will land with some of our other content. You mentioned Lotus. Isn't that where Colin Chapman was?
Correct. He was the owner.
And so is this during the era of Ground Effect, or am I totally too
Not
early?
yet.
Am I a decade early?
Yeah. When Hill won his world championship in 1968, you're looking at, call it 8 years before the first kind of forays into ground effect shows up.
Okay. All right. I'm trying to put it all in the pieces in my head of where it's all.
This is where cars started spreading wings.
Okay. Very good. All right. So then let's move on to someone who I know is near and dear to your heart.
Absolutely.
And we've talked about in some different episodes and different pieces, but this is the time for you to let one of your heroes shine.
Yeah, Jackie Stewart. So, like Jim Clark, Stewart was born in Scotland and he began racing almost by accident. Again, came from very humble means. Stewart's natural ability for driving racing cars was, very evident pretty much from the get go. And so he started getting rides in sports cars that were owned by, wealthy racing enthusiasts. And again, like Clark, Stewart would not have progressed if it wasn't for these wealthy guys giving him a shot, by sponsoring them. And I use the word sponsor in air quotes, but sponsorship back then was a very different thing from what it is today. That's for sure. So he had success in sports cars and was spotted by a guy who ran a team in Formula 3. The guy's name was Ken Tyrrell. And Tyrrell put him in one of his Formula 3 cars, had never raced Formula 3, and Stewart went out and won 7 races in a row. And so clearly the young man had some talent. And so he was picked up by BRM, the same team that Graham Hill won his first world championship for. And he did manage to win 2 races with that team. And in 1968, Ken Tyrrell came knocking and said, "Hey, I've done a deal with Matra, which is a French defense contractor who decided to get into Formula One." And Matra, very interestingly, they built a V12 engine for Formula One. And Ken Tyrrell wasn't all that keen on that engine. And so he said, "I tell you what, I'll take the Matra chassis, but I want to put a Ford Cosworth engine in it, and we'll run 2 of your cars, and you guys can run 2 of your cars with the V12 engine." Well, guess what? Jackie Stewart with that Matra and the Ford engine were very competitive, and they very nearly won the 1968 World Championship. Graham Hill won the Mexican Grand Prix to ice that championship and bring the championship to Lotus. However, what happened from then on is that Stewart and Tyrrell really got it together, and using another Matra powered by Ford in 1969, they dominated the world championship, and then Matra pulled out. And so they were forced at kind of the last minute to have to run a new car called the March. It was designed by a number of people, but the March company included people like Max Mosley, who later went on to run Formula One. And the car wasn't very good. And early in the year, they figured out that the car wasn't very good. And so in secret, Ken Tyrrell commissioned a Formula One car to be built to be called the Tyrrell. And Tyrrell was a lumber merchant, believe it or not. And the garage was literally one of the barns that housed lumber cutting equipment, and they had made a space to prepare the Formula One cars. This is a very different era, sawdust on the floors and all that kind of stuff. But they built this car in secret and shocked the world when they showed up at a race right at the end of the 1970 season. It was in Canada, and the car suddenly showed pace. So with that car, Stewart then went out and won the 1971 World Championship. He battled an ulcer in 1972, so he wasn't at peak form. And then with a new design from Tyrrell in 1973, he won the World Championship again, retiring at the end of the 1973 season. So, the guy wound up with more wins than Jim Clark, and his record stood really for quite a while. He wound up winning 27 Grand Prix. Um, and his winning percentage was 27%. So he was very close to somebody like a Michael Schumacher or a Max Verstappen in terms of win percentage, and he actually had a greater win percentage than either Alain Prost or Ayrton Senna. So that gives you an idea of the kind of talent that this guy was. So we talk about all of that and his on-track record and all that, which is pretty phenomenal. But it's what he did off the track for Formula One that really left the most impact, because he was the one who really put it out there and crusaded for safety in Formula One cars and the tracks that they raced on. And among the things that he did was introduce the full face helmet to Formula One, the full 6-point seatbelt harnesses, and he also helped develop the Grand Prix medical unit that began traveling up to all the races. And this is the seatbelts and the Grand Prix medical unit. If you remember when we talked about some of the tragedies that hit Formula One, that came about as a result of the death of his friend Jochen Rindt. And then of course, he was very adamant that circuit standards be improved for safety. So safety barriers were put up, runoff areas started to be introduced, because not only did he want to protect drivers, he wanted to protect the spectators as well. Ultimately, Jackie was knighted in 2001, and to this day can be seen at most Grand Prix. He's still a huge spokesman for the sport of Formula One. Just an incredible story. And oh, by the way, he was dyslexic. He actually thought that he was really, really stupid. He couldn't, couldn't go to school, couldn't figure out how to read. And yet he was one of the very top. I believe he was on the Scottish Olympic team for trap shooting. He was quite the shot. And he was doing that before he started racing cars. So quite an interesting guy.
Yeah, I love that bit at the end. That felt like a bit of a curveball. Like, I was like, okay, I'm tracking. I've heard this. I like this. Wait, what? That's so cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I think what you said about him showing up at even races today, I agree. I've noticed how many times he comes, and considering how intense the schedule is, the fact that he's flying around and doing all that at the age that he is,
Yeah.
just shows the love for the sport that he has. If all the other stuff you noted hadn't been there, that's just like icing, I guess, on the cake of his devotion to motorsport and specifically to Formula One. And again, in the book that I had been reading, it noted that he had 57 drivers die over the course of his career.
Yeah.
And let me read this quote, because again, the writer did such a good job on this. I'm not being paid for this promotion. I should note that. Stewart never spilled a drop of blood when racing, but having lost 57 fellow drivers during that time, his brave and resolute campaign for safety would indirectly save many more from serious injury or worse over the decades to follow. And that's literally the last paragraph that they have in his profile. And I thought, what a testament to his desire to not see that happen. And there's a quote in here that he gave. It was, "When I was a driver, it would have been far easier to have kept quiet about safety. I'd have been a much more popular world champion if I'd said what people wanted to hear me say. I might not have been alive, mind you, but more popular." And
Yeah.
I think that that's a calculation that, again, in 2024, we may not fully grasp that people like him and their choice to use the platform for the benefit of the sport, and especially to minimize injury and or death, and it was at a personal sacrifice for him to do that and to put his credibility out there. I think that that's something we really should respect and honor. Then when you add in what you said about his learning challenges and also the other areas of interest for him, I think it breaks some of the misconceptions about looking at a driver, a racer, in just one lens and not seeing the holistic person and or what adversity they're getting through every time they get into the car. So that's really cool. I've thought that every time you've shared new things about Jackie Stewart and how he is a hero to you, I always walk away understanding not only about him, but also about you. And I appreciate you sharing that. So thank you.
One thing that I will add is that it used to be on Netflix, and I don't know if it still is, but there was a movie shot by, of all people, Roman Polanski I guess he shot it with like a handheld 16 millimeter camera. where he follows Jackie Stewart through the 1971 Monaco Grand Prix. And it is absolutely brilliant. It's called Weekend with a Champion. And I won't spoil the end of it because the end is absolutely fabulous. But it really gives you an insight into Stewart and the kind of guy he was and how he was so switched on to his fans and how devoted he was to his wife Helen and her to him. It's seriously cool. So if you can find it, Weekend with a Champion, highly recommend it.
Okay, well, it's going on my watch list if I can figure out where it is. I love it.
It was on Netflix.
Yes, I will look them up. Well, so if any of our listeners find it, feel free to send it our way, or any other recommendations, I should say. We would be excited to talk about other legends, or maybe you disagree with where Dick chose. We'd love to hear any of that, I think. And then we're going to keep doing this series, and there are more decades to get us all the way up to the 2020s.
Exactly.
And Dick, I really am looking forward to this. Thank you so much for suggesting that we go in this route.
Yeah, it's fun.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.